Hello and welcome. This is Innsbruck Airport, a beautiful small international airport nestled in the Austrian Alps. It is often seen as one of the most difficult and challenging airports pilots can fly into. In fact, the Austrian authorities demand that if you are a real-world pilot and you want to fly an aircraft into this airport, you need to be experienced, you need to undergo a training course and a 2-hour sim assessment, which has to be renewed every 12 months. Only if you meet all these criteria are you allowed to fly into this airport. Now, I have flown in and out of Innsbruck many times, and in this short video series I would like to explain to you why this airport is so challenging, how we operate in and out of it, and how you can emulate this on Microsoft Flight Simulator. Okay, let's get started. Welcome back to Innsbruck. In the last two episodes we looked at how we can arrive here and land. Now in this episode we need to take off again to fly back to where we came from. Now there's a few things we need to bear in mind when we take off from Innsbruck. Terrain, once again, a big topic today, but there's some other things as well, such as the APU, which we're gonna be treating like we did on the arrival, and the preferred runway direction. Now, according to the airport documentation, the preferred runway for takeoff is runway 26, but to be honest with you, 99% of the time we take off on runway 08. The reason being that for runway 26 you need to have a certain visibility and cloud ceiling, which often is not the case, and also 08 is just more convenient for almost all our departures. We'll be looking at both departures though. So let's start with 08, which is by far the most common departure, at least in my personal experience. So a few things before we get started, and what I'm about to discuss is valid for both runways. So you need to be taking off with the APU on and the APU bleed on, and we need to keep this on until we're above MSA. Then you switch it off. Please don't forget it. It's not something that is usual, therefore it's easy to forget. We usually create some kind of a trigger in the cockpit where we say when we do this we automatically tie that in with the APU. The other thing is that you will need a takeoff alternate. Takeoff alternate means usually when we take off somewhere and we have an engine failure and we need to return, we just come back from where we took off. Innsbruck is not one of those airports. You cannot, well, I suppose you could return, but it is really not something you should be doing. So what you need to do is you need to think, where do I go if I have an engine failure, and need to put that airport in here. The closest airport would be Salzburg, but Salzburg, at least in my company, we are not allowed to use as an alternate. It's too complex, too complicated, especially the single engine go-round procedure. Therefore we always use Munich if the weather allows it. So let's put in Munich. Otherwise you have Stuttgart, you have Linz, you have Graz, you have Vienna. So there's plenty of airports around here you can choose. But Munich will be the closest. And like I said, you check the weather, you make sure you can go there in case of an engine failure, and that's going to be your takeoff alternate. So these are some of the considerations. Another one is that a takeoff with flaps 1 plus F is not allowed. This has to do with the engine out procedure. If you lose an engine, you have to perform some tight turns. Also on the normal departure on runway 26, you have to perform some really tight turns and fly at low speeds, no faster than 160 knots. So flaps 2 or flaps 3 is what you need to use for takeoff. We tend to aim for flaps 2 if it's possible, for the simple reason that if we have an engine failure, you have a better rate of climb. But if flap 3 is what you need, then of course that's what we use. Okay, I've set up a very basic route here. We're just gonna be flying from Innsbruck to Vienna. Once again, we need to make sure our alternate is Munich. And yeah, let's look at the departures. So if we click here on departure, runway 08, you have all these departures, and to be honest, the Phoenix is really well scripted that way. These are pretty much the real world departures, and they have all the restrictions you need to follow. Personally, we usually fly this departure here. I can show you why. This is because when we take off from Innsbruck, we almost always head south. So we usually fly from here to Greece, to Italy, to Spain, places like that. So we do a lot of flights with tourists from Innsbruck into the southern part of Europe. So this is our departure that we usually fly. It's pretty straightforward. If you look at the flight plan page, you can see here some restrictions. Like I said, there's some tight turns here. You can't be faster than 165 knots. You need to achieve that. So these are some considerations you need to go by, but generally speaking, it's actually a fairly straightforward affair. This goes for all the other departures as well. Just choose the one you need and follow exactly what you have to do in terms of altitude and speed. So we are going to Vienna, so this departure wouldn't actually make all that much sense. Let's have a look. I think this departure here, the Rattenberg to Quebec, would make a lot of sense because it takes us out of here, and then we just fly on to Vienna. So let's actually put that in, and that's now gonna be our departure. So what if we lose an engine? Well, the engine procedure is actually the same as the bulked landing procedure. If you have watched the first two videos, you now know what I'm talking about. So for this particular runway, if you remember, we fly out on the localizer and then we fly to Rattenberg. With this particular departure, I think you could fly this with one engine because this is pretty much the bulked landing procedure. So here in the sim, I would be happy with this. In the real world, of course, we have to set it up properly. So let me show you how we could possibly do that. Right, so we start the way we usually start. We go to secondary, copy active. This will give us the flight plan from the primary into the secondary. And I think the best way to set this up here in the sim, you just choose any of these points. Click on this one, new destination, put in Innsbruck. And here we click on arrival and you just choose this arrival here, localizer west 08. We don't need a star. Okay, so white, as you probably remember, is secondary, green is primary. So what we have now is this arrival here, but what this will give us is a go-round that goes out of here to Rattenberg. And this is what we want to fly in case of engine failure. So the procedure will be the following. Let me just zoom in here. We take off. Let's say we have an engine failure shortly after takeoff. You would go to secondary, activate secondary. That will then put in the secondary flight plan. And then you go to direct to and put in the waypoint that's ahead of you. So if we go back to the secondary flight plan, you see the go round is down here in blue. It's probably gonna be this point here. So you go direct to Delta Oscar 63 Sierra, put that in. The aircraft is going back into nav mode, and then you're gonna be flying there and then to Rattenberg. And then if you don't do anything, the aircraft will go into a holding pattern at Rattenberg. And that would be a good procedure in case you lose an engine. So this is how, I guess, is an easy and very elegant way to do this here in the sim. Of course, what this means is, because you have your normal flight plan in the primary and the arrival here in the secondary, if you have an engine failure, once you've flown this, you need to set up your diversion. But you know, engine failures on an Airbus are usually not that time critical. You can fly with the autopilot. The fly-by-wire system takes care of pretty much everything. So you would go into the hold, set up the diversion, and then go to Munich. So that way it's actually quite relaxed. If you have a fire on board, then of course it becomes more time critical. You would not go into a hold. You would request a heading towards Munich and then just change the destination here to Munich, set up the ILS. You're not going to be flying any stars or anything. You're on a Mayday, and then just fly in onto the ILS and land the aircraft as fast as possible. And that will be our planning for a departure like this. The other thing of note, if you depart, sometimes ATC will give you shortcuts because they try to be nice. Be fully aware that you can only do this if you are visual with the mountains and you can be 100% sure that you are above the mountains. The other option, of course, is because you're on radar vectors, you're allowed to look at your chart, have a look. Are you above any obstacles? If so, then you're allowed to turn. At least that's the procedure in my company. On the charts of my company, we can always see exactly where the aircraft is. Before any turn below MSA, we confirm the position of the aircraft. We confirm any kind of obstacles around us, and only if we are 100% happy that we can take that shortcut will we accept it. If we're not comfortable, if we're in a cloud, we feel we're a bit too low, we just say negative and request that we continue on the standard departure. You are the pilot, you're in charge, it's up to you whether you accept a shortcut from ATC or not. Okay, I've reset the sim and we are now on runway 26, so pointing the other way. The sim doesn't do the backtrack, it positioned us here. This is not what you should do. You should backtrack, turn around and start the takeoff run from back there. So I chose this runway in the menu hoping that the sim would put me towards the end. Unfortunately it didn't, so we've wasted quite a bit of distance here. So let's look at the departure from runway 26. I've put in a very basic route, this time from Innsbruck to Palma de Mallorca. Again, alternate is Munich. I just put in some waypoints that I know from the real world, and then arrival into Palma de Mallorca. But we have not yet a departure from here, from Innsbruck. So there are several ways to depart. The most common one is a visual departure, where you fly straight ahead and then you perform a visual turn to the left and then you fly outbound basically 180 degrees into the opposite direction. Now, as you can probably imagine, there are a lot of limitations in terms of this initial turn. The ceiling needs to be quite high, the visibility needs to be quite high. This is usually company specific, but essentially if you look outside and it doesn't look like this and you can't make out these hills here around you, you cannot fly the visual departure. It's just not safe. Then you have to fly something else. There are several departures that take you out into the valley and then you come back later on. But of course, in terms of fuel and time, the departure where you perform a turn pretty much exactly after takeoff, turn around and fly back on yourself is the best should you want to go into that direction. Once again, we need to switch on the APU. And once it's running, the APU bleed. Right, this departure we are actually going to fly, and so there's one thing I need to show you which is important for both departures. So when you go into the performance page here, you need to change these figures here. So if you take off from runway 26, this needs to be 7,000, 9,500, and the engine out acceleration altitude needs to be 7,000. If you take off from runway 08, then this needs to be 5,000, 7,000, and the engine out acceleration stays at 7,000. So these are non-standard figures. They have been calculated to give you the best performance, and you should use them on every single departure. So we are taking off on runway 26, so it's going to be 7,000 and 9,500. So it's going to be a bit unusual for you because the thrust reduction is very late, and then the aircraft is not going to accelerate. So you're going to go back into climb detent, but the pitch will stay the same, and that will come a bit later on. We have some departures like this. Zurich is another example. We'll go through it together, and you'll see what that looks like. So what about the departure down here in the MCDU? So if we click on the departure, runway 26, the one that comes closest is this one here, Rattenberg 1 Romeo. So you can see we fly straight ahead, we perform a turn and then fly outbound this way. This is the preferred departure. The thing is, let's just activate this. This initial turn usually has to be flown by hand, and this has to do with the bank angle. You need to keep a very precise bank angle here, and the autopilot will sometimes not do that and overshoot, and that is not acceptable. You need to be exactly on this green line here. So if you want to do this like we do it in the real world, this is a visual part of the departure. We don't actually use any of this. We just need to follow this here, 160 knots, and then you just fly out here, make this very tight turn, come out here, and from here you can switch on the autopilot. And this is why you need to be visual with the terrain, because you have quite high hills here right in front of the mountains, and this could be quite dangerous if you're not visual with what's around you. In terms of engine out procedure, it's again the bulked landing procedure, so we would not be performing this turn, we would be flying straight ahead. So we do pretty much the same as we did before. We'll go to secondary, copy active, click on any of the points, we change our destination to Innsbruck, and then we choose an arrival on runway 26. If I remember correctly, it was this one, no star, and what that does, it gives you this go around procedure here, which is essentially the bulked landing procedure, and the procedure is going to be the same. You may remember from our first video, this is a very long procedure. You fly all the way out here, you turn around, you come back on ourselves, and then you fly out here to Rattenberg. So procedure is the same. Let's say we lose an engine shortly after takeoff, pull heading as always, then go to secondary, activate secondary, then go to direct 2 and put in the first point. In this case it's probably gonna be Whiskey India 005. The aircraft will go into nav mode and fly this whole procedure, and that will give you time to settle in, to secure the engine, go through the ECAM procedure. By the time you reach Rattenberg, you'll be done with everything and you can immediately go into the diversion. So that's how I would set up this in the sim. Again, in the real world it's a little bit easier for us because all these things are pre-programmed, but here we just have to fiddle around with it. But to be honest, this is all very close to the real world procedures. So all that's left to do now is to fly this departure, and once we're out here we'll leave it at that, and then we are finally finished with Innsbruck Airport. Okay, so the aircraft is ready, APU is running, APU bleed is on, all the lights are on, cabin is good, everything is set, flaps 2, and yeah, I think we can go. So take off. Manflex 44, SRS, auto thrust blue. .100 knots. I hate the rudder on the sim, way too sensitive. V1, rotate. 15 degrees, positive climb, gear up. Right, this commands a turn to the right. We don't do this in the real world, but I will follow it for now. We would just go straight into a left turn here, but actually let me do that. So let's fly it like we do in the real world. So we go into a tight turn, make sure we have a nice climb going. We do not go above 160 knots. Here we go. If you want, you can pull the speed. Okay, we can go back to thrust climb, but as you can see, we keep the pitch pretty much where it is. We keep the turn going. And we are heading outbound. Very nice. Wings level. And now, because we haven't flown the departure the way it wanted us to, we just go to direct to. It's this one here, the 3-1. Insert, and there we are. So we're now in nav mode. We can switch on the autopilot. We keep the 160 till we pass this point. If you look down, you can see the airport is now underneath us, and now the aircraft is gonna be flying outbound here towards Rattenberg, and then from there we would start the routing. So let's have a look. After Rattenberg, I have a disco. Let's get rid of that. Yeah, it's okay. We're not going to be flying that routine, so it doesn't matter. And that's how it's done. It's a bit different to what the sim wanted me to do. So speed is managed. We can go to flaps 1. Speed checked. Flaps 1. It's a bit different to what we do in the real world. This is a purely visual departure. I mean, you can do the same. Just take off and turn to the left. So to give you some details about the visual turn, we essentially fly straight ahead, and at around about 1.2 miles from the Oscar Echo Victor, we then perform this turn with no more than 160 knots, around about 25 to 30 degrees bank, and then we intercept the outbound towards Oscar Echo Juliet. So that's how it's written in my documentation, flap 0, and that's how we would fly this. So here it's a bit more conservative. You do a turn to the right, and then you do this long turn. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. If this is how it's coded, you can fly it, but like I said, our visual departure is slightly different. Okay, we've passed 10,000 feet. You can see the QNH is flashing. So we can go to standard. Come on. And at this point we can pretty much switch off the APU. We no longer need the landing lights. Taxi lights can come off. These can come off. And now you just follow the routing. So departure is not that difficult as long as you don't have an engine failure. Then the workload becomes a bit higher than at other airports, but the departures themselves are actually quite alright. And that's it. We have finished Innsbruck. We have discussed everything I personally can think of. So yeah, let's leave it there. Okay, and as we climb out here of Innsbruck Airport, we have reached the end of this video and therefore the end of this mini-series on Innsbruck Airport. I hope you found it useful, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best, bye bye.